The emergency lights flickered in the Metropolitan Museum as Sarah's fingers brushed the ornate Viking bracelet behind the shattered display case. One moment she was a lonely librarian running from her ex-husband's threats. The next she stood on a windswept Norwegian cliff facing a towering warrior with ice-blue eyes and battle scars. "You're not safe. Stand behind me," Ragnar growled, his massive frame shielding her from the approaching army of shadow creatures emerging from the forest. But Sarah wasn't just any modern woman lost in time. The bracelet had awakened something ancient in her blood. She was the last descendant of a powerful Viking sorceress, and her arrival in the past had broken a 1,000-year seal protecting both timelines. As the creatures circled closer, Ragnar's warriors trembled with fear. They'd never seen anything like these beings of pure darkness. But when Sarah's hands began to glow with ethereal light, everyone realized the quiet woman behind the fierce warrior might be more dangerous than any enemy they'd ever faced. What happens when a woman discovers she's not the victim needing protection, but the weapon that could save or destroy everything? The cold bite of ancient Norwegian air filled Sarah's lungs as reality crashed over her like a violent wave. This couldn't be happening. Minutes ago, she'd been hiding in the museum after hours, seeking refuge from David's latest round of threatening texts. The security guard's footsteps had echoed through the Norse exhibition hall as she'd crouched behind the Viking display, her heart hammering against her ribs. Now, impossibly, she stood on rough stone beneath an alien sky, surrounded by men who looked like they'd stepped from the pages of a history book. Their leather and chainmail gleamed dully in the strange, shifting light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Ragnar!" one of the warriors called out, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The prophecy speaks true. She bears the mark of Freya." Sarah glanced down at her hands, gasping at the soft golden radiance pulsing beneath her skin. The light moved like liquid fire through her veins, warm and alive, responding to emotions she couldn't name. The Viking bracelet, now somehow fused to her wrist, hummed with the same ethereal energy. "Impossible," another warrior whispered. The bloodline was severed. The Volva Astrid died childless. The shadow creatures pressed closer, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke given malevolent purpose. They had no faces. Yet Sarah could feel their hunger, their ancient rage directed specifically at her. Through the growing dread, she heard fragments of memory that weren't her own, chanted words in a language she'd never learned, images of a woman with her face standing before a great stone circle, power crackling between her fingers as she spoke words that bound darkness itself. Ragnar's hand moved to the massive war axe at his side. "They seek the seal breaker. They've waited 1,000 years for this moment." He turned his head slightly, ice-blue eyes finding hers. "You are not what you seem, woman. I can smell the magic on you, old and wild as the winter storms." "I don't understand any of this," Sarah said, her voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to howl around them. "I'm just a librarian from New York. I was hiding from my ex-husband, and I touched that bracelet and—" "Your bloodline carries the debt," Ragnar interrupted. "Astrid, the seal keeper, was your ancestor, though she hid her child well to protect the secret. The binding she created was meant to hold until the world's ending, but blood calls to blood. Your touch has undone her greatest work." The shadow creatures began to coalesce into more solid forms, twisted approximations of wolves and bears, with eyes like burning coals and claws that seemed to drink in the light around them. Their howls filled the air with sounds that made Sarah's bones ache. "How many?" Ragnar asked his men. "Too many," came the grim reply. "They pour from every shadow, every dark place. The seal's breaking has given them strength." Sarah felt something stirring deeper within her, as if the glowing energy in her hands was merely the surface of something vast and unknowable. Images flashed through her mind, not memories but knowledge. The shadow creatures were called the Morketrapper, beings of pure entropy that existed to unmake creation itself. They'd been bound beneath the earth by her ancestors' sacrifice, held in check by an intricate web of magic that required a blood price. "Stand ready," Ragnar commanded his warriors. though his eyes never left Sarah's face. Whatever happens, the seal breaker must not fall to them. If she dies while the binding is broken, they'll pour into both worlds, yours and ours. Everything will burn. The golden light emanating from Sarah's skin began to pulse faster, matching her racing heartbeat. She could feel the weight of two worlds pressing down on her shoulders, the responsibility of powers she didn't understand, flowing through bloodlines she'd never known existed. The first shadow creature lunged forward with a bone-chilling shriek, and Sarah's world exploded into chaos and light. The cold bit through Emma's thin cardigan like needles, and the acrid smell of smoke filled her nostrils. She blinked hard, expecting the sterile white walls of the museum to materialize around her, but instead found herself staring at a sky painted in shades of amber and crimson. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across what appeared to be a wooden fortress surrounded by crude earthwork walls. "This isn't happening," she whispered, her breath forming visible puffs in the frigid air. The pendant still pulsed against her palm, warm despite the bitter cold. She tried to release it, but her fingers wouldn't obey, as if some invisible force welded her skin to the ancient metal. The sound of heavy footsteps crunching through frost-covered grass made her spin around. A man approached. No, not just a man, but what could only be described as a force of nature wrapped in fur and leather. He stood easily 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to block out half the sky. Golden hair fell to his shoulders, braided with small bones and metal rings that caught the dying light. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, ice blue and intense, studying her with a mixture of recognition and something that might have been relief. "You came," he said in accented English, his voice deep and resonant. The vulva spoke true. Emma took a step backward, her sensible museum flats slipping on the uneven ground. "I don't understand. Where am I? How do you speak English?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, though it didn't reach those penetrating eyes. "I am Ragnar Eriksson, and I speak many tongues. Trade demands it." He gestured toward the fortress behind him. "As for where you stand in Kattegat, in the lands of the Danes. The year of our Lord—" He paused, frowning. "Your Christian monks would call it 790 to 3 summers since their god walked among men." The world tilted sideways. Emma's free hand flew to her mouth as nausea rolled through her stomach. "That's impossible. Time travel doesn't exist. This has to be some kind of elaborate joke, or maybe I hit my head and I'm unconscious on the museum floor." Ragnar moved closer, and she caught the scent of leather, steel, and something wild, like pine forests and ocean spray. "Feel the cold," he said simply. "Taste the smoke on the wind. Dreams do not bite with such teeth." As if summoned by his words, a gust of Arctic air swept across the settlement, cutting through her cardigan like it was made of tissue paper. Emma shivered violently, wrapping her arms around herself. Whatever this was, hallucination, coma dream, or impossible reality, the cold was definitely real. "The pendant," Ragnar said, his gaze dropping to her clenched fist. "Show it to me." "I can't let go of it." Emma opened her fingers with effort, revealing the now glowing artifact. The intricate knotwork seemed to writhe in the fading light, and the central stone pulsed like a heartbeat. It stuck to my hand. Something shifted in Ragnar's expression, triumph mixed with apprehension. "Mjolnir's hammer," he breathed. "It truly is you, the flame-haired woman from the distant future, marked by the gods to—" He stopped abruptly, jaw tightening. "Marked for what?" Emma demanded, but before he could answer, a commotion erupted from the direction of the fortress. A woman emerged from the wooden gates, moving with predatory grace despite her advanced age. Her white hair was woven with raven feathers and silver charms, and her pale eyes held an otherworldly gleam. Behind her trailed a group of warriors, their hands resting on sword hilts. "Ragnar Eriksson," the woman called, her voice carrying easily across the distance. "You meddle with forces beyond your understanding. The prophecy speaks of salvation but also of destruction. Can you not feel it already beginning?" Emma felt it then, a subtle wrongness in the air, like the oppressive silence before a thunderstorm. The pendant's glow intensified, and pain shot up her arm. In the distance, she heard what sounded like ice cracking, though she could see no frozen water nearby. Astrid, Ragnar acknowledged the woman with a curt nod. The ritual is complete. She has come, as the gods willed it. As the gods willed, yes, Astrid replied, stopping just outside of conversational distance. But mortals who grasp at divine power oft find it burns their fingers to bone. The crossing of worlds tears holes in the fabric of reality itself. Look around you, warrior. Do you see nothing amiss? Emma followed the old woman's gesture and gasped. The shadows cast by the setting sun were wrong. Some fell upward toward the sky, while others stretched in impossible directions. The very air seemed to shimmer and warp, as if she were looking through flawed glass. "The curse," she whispered, remembering the museum placard's warning about those who would claim the pendant's power. Ragnar's hand moved to his sword. "We will face whatever comes. The prophecy may doom us all," Astrid finished coldly. The great hall fell silent as tombstones. Every eye fixed on Sarah, and she could feel the weight of their stares like physical touches against her skin. The warrior who had claimed her, Eric, she'd heard someone call him, stood between her and the crowd of Vikings, his massive frame rigid with tension. "Explain yourself, Ragnar." Eric's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What curse do you speak of?" The old man stepped forward, his weathered face grave. White braids hung past his shoulders, adorned with small bones and metal charms that clinked softly as he moved. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "The prophecy speaks of two sides of the same coin, my lord, light and shadow, salvation and destruction." His pale eyes never left Sarah's face. The woman who would come to save our people would also bring with her the power to unmake everything we hold dear. Sarah's hands trembled. She wrapped her arms around herself, acutely aware of how out of place she looked in her jeans and sweater among these people draped in leather, fur, and rough-woven cloth. "I don't understand any of this. I was just looking at an exhibit about Viking artifacts, and then—" "The binding stone," Ragnar interrupted, his eyes widening. "You touched the binding stone. If that's what you call that crystalline thing, then yes." Sarah's voice cracked. "It was just sitting there behind glass, but somehow I could touch it, and when I did—" "The barriers between worlds grow thin," Ragnar whispered, and several people in the crowd made what looked like protective gestures. "The stone was created by the gods themselves to anchor the 9 realms in their proper places. But if disturbed by one not of this time—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Eric's jaw tightened. "Speak plainly, old man. The realms begin to bleed into one another. What belongs in Helheim may find its way here. What belongs here may be cast into the void." Ragnar's gaze shifted to Eric. "Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual since her arrival?" Sarah caught the almost imperceptible glance Eric shot toward the shadows near the great hall's entrance. Something flickered there, a darkness that seemed to move independently of the firelight. Her breath caught in her throat. "The shadows have been restless," Eric admitted, his hand moving instinctively to the axe at his belt. "And the livestock grow nervous without cause." "It has begun, then." Ragnar nodded grimly. "The curse awakens. Each day she remains here without fulfilling the prophecy, the boundaries weaken further. Eventually chaos itself will spill into our world." A woman near the fire suddenly gasped and pointed toward the great doors. The heavy wooden barriers creaked and groaned, though no wind stirred the air inside the hall. Frost began forming along their edges despite the warmth from the massive hearth. "What's happening?" Sarah pressed closer to Eric without thinking, and was surprised when his arm came around her shoulders, solid and reassuring. "The realms shift," Ragnar said, his voice tight with worry. "Niflheim touches our world. The realm of ice and mist seeks entry." The temperature in the hall plummeted. Sarah's breath began misting in the suddenly frigid air, and several Vikings reached for their weapons, though what good steel would do against supernatural forces remained unclear. "How do we stop it?" Eric demanded. Ragnar's ancient eyes moved between Eric and Sarah. "The prophecy must be fulfilled. She is bound to you now, whether by fate or by the stone's power. Only by accepting that bond completely can the barriers be restored." "What does that mean exactly?" Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Marriage," Ragnar said simply. "A true union, blessed by the gods and consummated in their sight. Only then will the realms recognize her as belonging here, and the curse will be satisfied." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Marriage? To him? I don't even know him. This is insane. I need to go home, back to my own time. There has to be another way." The frost on the doors spread further, and now ice crystals began forming on the weapons hanging from the walls. Eric's grip on her tightened. "There is no other way," Ragnar said, not unkindly. "The stone brought you here for a purpose. Fight it and both worlds suffer. Your modern realm and ours will tear apart at the seams." Sarah stared at the spreading ice, at the frightened faces of the Vikings around her, at the growing shadows that seemed to reach toward them with grasping fingers. Everything in her logical modern mind rebelled against what she was hearing, but the evidence was literally freezing around her. She looked up at Eric, this fierce stranger who claimed destiny had bound them together. His blue eyes met hers, and she saw something unexpected there, not just determination or duty, but a flicker of understanding, perhaps even compassion. The ice crept closer, and reality crystallized around her as surely as the frost spreading across stone. The morning mist clung to the village like ghostly fingers, and Emma found herself being led through narrow paths between wooden longhouses by a woman named Astrid. The Viking woman's auburn hair was braided with small bones and beads that clicked softly as she walked, and her weathered hands gestured expressively as she spoke in rapid Norse. "Astrid says you must be prepared properly," Bjorn translated, walking beside them with his massive frame casting long shadows. His voice carried a tension Emma hadn't heard before. "The ritual cannot proceed until sunset, but there are preparations." Emma pulled the rough woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders. The museum's climate control seemed like a luxury from another lifetime now. What kind of preparations? And what exactly is this ritual supposed to accomplish? Bjorn's jaw tightened. "The binding ceremony will make you my wife before the gods, but more than that." He stopped walking, forcing Emma to turn and face him. His blue eyes held a gravity that made her stomach clench. "It should anchor you to this time, prevent the curse from spreading between worlds." "Should?" Emma's voice pitched higher. "You mean you're not sure?" Before Bjorn could answer, Astrid barked something sharp and pointed toward a longhouse larger than the others. Smoke drifted from its roof, and Emma could smell herbs burning, something earthy and bitter that made her nose wrinkle. "The Volva waits," Bjorn said quietly. "The seeress. She will examine you, ensure you are truly the one from the prophecy." Emma's feet seemed to root themselves to the muddy ground. "And if I'm not?" The silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Around them, the village continued its morning routine. Children chased chickens between houses, women tended fires, men sharpened weapons, but Emma felt suspended outside of it all, caught between worlds and belonging to neither. "You are," Bjorn said finally, but his certainty seemed forced. "The signs all point to it. Your arrival, the disturbances in the spirit realm, the way the runestone called to you across centuries." Astrid grabbed Emma's arm with surprising strength and pulled her toward the longhouse. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and shadows. An ancient woman sat beside a central fire pit, her white hair hanging in thin braids adorned with feathers and small silver charms. Her eyes, when she lifted them to study Emma, were the pale blue of winter ice. The Volva spoke in a voice like rustling leaves, and Emma felt the words in her bones, even though she couldn't understand them. The old woman gestured for Emma to sit across from her, then began pulling items from a leather pouch. stones, dried herbs, what looked like carved animal teeth. "She will read the runes," Bjorn explained, settling beside Emma. His presence was warm and solid, an anchor in this strange ritual. "They will show us the truth of your nature and the path forward." The Volva cast the carved stones onto a piece of stretched leather between them. They clattered and rolled, settling into a pattern that made the old woman's breath hiss between her teeth. She studied them for long moments, occasionally muttering under her breath and touching individual runes with one gnarled finger. Emma found herself leaning forward despite her skepticism. In her world, she would have dismissed this as superstition, but here, with the memory of impossible transportation still fresh in her mind, she couldn't afford disbelief. The Volva's voice rose suddenly, urgent and sharp. She pointed at one particular stone, then at Emma, speaking rapidly to Bjorn. His face went pale beneath his beard. "What?" Emma demanded. "What is she saying?" Bjorn's hands clenched into fists. "She says you are indeed the bride from the prophecy, but—" He swallowed hard. "The curse has already begun to take hold. Your presence here is creating fractures between the worlds. She can see through to your time, see the destruction spreading there as well." Emma's blood turned to ice. "What kind of destruction?" "Earthquakes, storms. The barriers between realms growing thin." The Volva spoke again, and Bjorn translated with growing urgency. "She says people in your world are falling into visions of this time, losing themselves to madness. And here, our dead are rising from their graves, drawn by the disruption you've caused." As if summoned by her words, a commotion erupted outside, shouts of alarm and the clash of metal against metal. Bjorn was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "Stay here," he commanded, but Emma was already standing. Through the smoke hole in the roof, she could see flashes of unnatural light streaking across the morning sky. The very air seemed to shimmer and bend, and in the distance she could swear she heard sounds that didn't belong to this time. Car horns, the wail of sirens, the electronic buzz of modern life bleeding through the cracks between worlds. The Volva grabbed Emma's wrist with fingers like iron bands and spoke one final pronouncement that needed no translation. Her meaning was written in the terror on her ancient face. Time was running out. The morning mist clung to the fjord like ghostly fingers as Ilara emerged from Bjorn's longhouse, wrapped in a woolen cloak that scratched against her modern sensibilities. 3 days had passed since her arrival in this impossible time, and she still expected to wake up in her cramped Chicago apartment, not in a world where the air tasted of salt and smoke. "You cannot continue to avoid the seer," Bjorn's voice rumbled behind her. She turned to find him filling the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking out the dim light from within. Even after these few days, his presence still made her breath catch, a reaction that both thrilled and terrified her. "I'm not avoiding anyone," she lied, pulling the cloak tighter. "I'm just processing." His laugh was rich and deep. "Processing. Another of your strange words." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of leather and pine that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Ragnhild grows impatient. She says the signs grow stronger." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted near the harbor. Shouts echoed across the settlement as fishermen hauled their nets from the water. But instead of the morning's catch, silvery fish floated belly up, their eyes clouded white. "That's the 3rd time this week," Bjorn muttered, his jaw tightening. "First the livestock falling sick, now this." Ilara's stomach dropped. Since her arrival, she'd noticed the small disturbances, milk souring overnight, children waking from nightmares screaming about darkness beneath the earth, and now this. The villagers had begun to whisper, shooting glances her way when they thought she wasn't looking. "They think it's because of me," she said quietly. Bjorn's hand found her shoulder, warm and reassuring through the wool. "Old Ragnhild speaks of a prophecy, but prophecies are like morning fog. They shift and change depending on where you stand." Before she could respond, a young boy came running toward them, his face pale with fear. "Bjorn Ironside, come quickly. Something's wrong with the runestone." They followed the boy through the winding paths between the longhouses, past the forge where the blacksmith's hammer had fallen silent, past the weaving shed where women peered out with worried faces. A crowd had gathered at the village's heart, surrounding the ancient stone that stood twice the height of a man. Elara gasped. The runestone, which she'd been told contained protective wards carved by their ancestors, was changing. The ancient symbols writhed and shifted across its surface as if the stone itself were alive. Where once there had been runes of protection and prosperity, new markings appeared, dark, angular symbols that seemed to drink in the morning light. "By Thor's hammer," someone whispered. The village seer, Ragnhild, stood before the stone with her gnarled hands outstretched, her milky eyes, blind to this world but seeing far beyond it, fixed on Elara with unnerving accuracy. "The weaver of fates has come at last, but the pattern she brings is torn, child, torn between two worlds." "I don't understand any of this," Elara said, stepping backward into Bjorn's solid presence. "I just touched a piece of metal in a museum. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Intent matters little to the Norns," Ragnhild replied, shuffling closer. "What matters is that you are here, and your presence has awakened something that has slept for centuries." She pointed a crooked finger at the transforming stone. "The barrier between worlds grows thin. Ancient hungers stir in the darkness below." The stone suddenly cracked with a sound like thunder. The new symbols flared with an otherworldly light before going dark again. In the silence that followed, Elara could swear she heard something, a whisper, a promise, a threat, just beyond the edge of hearing. "What does it mean?" Bjorn demanded. Ragnhild's expression was grim. "It means the curse of the Cedar Kings has awakened. They who were banished beyond the veil now sense a way home." A blind gaze found Elara again. Through her. The crowd began to murmur, and Elara caught fragments of their words. Witch, bringer of doom, curse. Fear crept up her spine as she realized how quickly their curious acceptance could turn to hostility. "Enough," Bjorn's voice cut through the whispers like a blade. "She is under my protection. Any who would harm her will answer to me." But even as he spoke, Elara could see doubt flickering in the eyes around them. The dead fish, the sick animals, and now this corruption of their sacred stone. All since her arrival. She didn't understand the prophecy or the curse or any of it, but one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear. Her presence here wasn't just changing her own fate, but threatening the very fabric of this world. As if responding to her thoughts, the wind picked up, carrying with it a chill that had nothing to do with the season. And somewhere in that wind she could swear she heard laughter, ancient, hungry, and patient as the grave. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village as Astrid stepped out of Bjorn's longhouse, her borrowed woolen dress feeling foreign against her skin. 3 days had passed since her arrival, and she was no closer to understanding how to return home, or if she even wanted to anymore. The thought struck her like a physical blow. Where had that come from? "You look troubled, bride-to-be." Ragnhild's voice carried a hint of mockery as she approached, flanked by 2 other women. The blacksmith's daughter had made no secret of her displeasure at Astrid's sudden appearance and claimed status. "Just thinking," Astrid replied, straightening her shoulders. She'd learned quickly that showing weakness here was dangerous. "Thinking can be perilous for a woman," Ragnhild said, her pale eyes glittering, "especially one who claims to speak with the gods but cannot even start a proper fire." The other women giggled, and Astrid felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was true. Her attempts at basic Viking-era survival skills had been embarrassing failures, but she wasn't about to be intimidated by medieval mean girls. "Perhaps where I come from, we have different skills," Astrid said evenly. "I may not be able to weave like you, but I can read the stars, predict eclipses, and heal wounds with methods your healers have never imagined." Ragnhild's expression shifted, uncertainty flickering across her features. "Prove it." Before Astrid could respond, shouts erupted from the harbour. The women turned as one, watching warriors run toward the water's edge. Through the crowd, Astrid caught sight of Bjorn's massive frame moving with deadly purpose, toward a newly arrived longship. "Raiders," one of the women whispered. "But whose banner is that?" Astrid squinted at the blood-red sail emblazoned with a black raven. Something about the symbol made her stomach clench with dread. "Grim the bloodthirsty," Ragnhild breathed, her earlier hostility replaced by fear. "What does he want here?" They followed the crowd toward the harbour, staying well back from the confrontation brewing at the water's edge. Bjorn stood with his warriors, hands resting on their sword hilts, facing a group of men who radiated menace like heat from a forge. Their leader was tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair and scars that mapped violence across his visible skin. When he smiled, it was the expression of a wolf eyeing sheep. "Bjorn Ironwolf," Grim called out, his voice carrying easily across the tension-thick air. "I hear congratulations are in order. A bride fallen from the heavens, they say. How fortuitous." Bjorn's jaw tightened. "State your business, Grim. You're not welcome here." "My business?" Grim laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Why, I've come to see this miracle woman for myself. Surely you wouldn't deny an old friend the chance to witness such wonder? We were never friends." "No," Grim agreed, his smile never wavering. "But we have shared interests now. You see, I've been having the most vivid dreams lately. Dark visions, a woman with hair like autumn leaves and eyes like the summer sky, standing at the crossroads between worlds. And in these dreams, she brings not prosperity, but destruction." Astrid's blood turned to ice. How could he know about her dreams, the nightmares that had been plaguing her since her arrival, images of villages burning, of the very fabric of reality tearing apart, of two worlds colliding in catastrophic violence? "Your dreams are of no concern to me," Bjorn said, but Astrid caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "Ah, but they should be." Grim's gaze swept the crowd until it landed directly on Astrid, despite the distance and the people between them. His pale eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Because the woman in my dreams bears a mark, a sign that she is not the blessing the prophecy promises, but its corruption, a curse wrapped in beauty." He raised his hand, and Astrid saw with growing horror that his palm bore a scar identical to the one that had appeared on her own hand the night she arrived, the same symbol that had been carved into the museum artifact. "The old gods speak to those who know how to listen," Grim continued, his voice somehow reaching her clearly despite the distance. "And they whisper that this woman will be the doom of both worlds, yours and the one she came from. Unless, of course, the curse is properly handled." Bjorn drew his sword in one fluid motion, the blade singing as it cleared its sheath. "You'll have to go through me, if necessary." Grim's hand moved to his own weapon. "But consider this, old enemy. When the skies begin to bleed and the earth cracks beneath your feet, when the very air becomes poison and the dead walk among the living, remember that I offered you a choice." The mark on Astrid's palm began to burn, and she gasped, clutching her hand to her chest. Several people turned at the sound, including Bjorn, whose eyes found hers across the crowd. In that moment, she saw not just concern but fear. Fear of her, or for her, she couldn't tell. Grim noticed Bjorn's distraction and smiled wider. "The curse has already begun." The great hall fell silent as Bjorn's hand slowly moved to his sword hilt. The air crackled with tension so thick Emma could taste it on her tongue like copper pennies. She stood frozen between the two warriors, acutely aware that one wrong word could spark a bloodbath. Magnus stepped closer, his own weapon gleaming in the torchlight. "And you cling to them like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Look around you, Bjorn. The crops wither, the fish flee our nets, the very stones of our walls crack without cause," his piercing blue eyes fixed on Emma. Since she arrived, Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. In the 3 days since she'd been brought to this settlement, she'd witnessed the strange phenomena Magnus described. Milk had soured overnight despite the cool weather. A perfectly healthy cow had simply collapsed and died. Most disturbing of all, the northern lights had appeared during broad daylight, painting the sky in unnatural shades of green and crimson. The curse is not of her making, Bjorn insisted, though Emma caught the flicker of uncertainty in his voice. The vulva spoke true. She is the bridge between worlds, sent to destroy us all, Magnus interrupted. The old woman's mind wanders like smoke. Her prophecies are riddled with shadows and half-truths. Emma found her voice at last. Maybe I should just go. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. If my being here is causing problems, then you cannot leave. Bjorn's declaration cut through the air like a blade. The prophecy, enough! Magnus's roar echoed off the rafters. I will not watch our people suffer for the sake of ancient words carved in stone. His sword sang as it cleared its sheath. If she will not go willingly, then I will send her to Valhalla myself. Emma stumbled backward as Magnus advanced, his weapon raised. She'd seen medieval combat in movies, but nothing had prepared her for the lethal grace of a trained Viking warrior. His movements were fluid, purposeful, terrifying. Bjorn moved to intercept his brother, drawing his own blade with practiced ease. Stand down, Magnus. I will not let you harm her. Then you force my hand, brother. The clash of steel rang out as the two men engaged. Emma pressed herself against the wooden pillar, watching in horror as the brothers circled each other. They moved with deadly precision, each knowing the other's style intimately. It was like watching a violent dance choreographed by fate itself. Around them, the other warriors formed a loose circle, their faces grim. No one intervened. This was a matter of honor now, of fundamental beliefs that could only be settled with blood. Emma's mind raced. There had to be something she could do, some way to stop this madness. Her fingers unconsciously went to the small pendant she wore, a piece of jewelry from the museum's gift shop that had somehow traveled back with her. As her skin made contact with the metal, the world suddenly shifted. The air shimmered, and for a moment she saw double, the great hall overlaid with images of the museum where her journey had begun. In that ghostly reflection, she glimpsed something that made her gasp. The artifact that had transported her was cracking, its ancient surface spider-webbed with fractures that pulsed with the same eerie light as the displaced aurora. The vision lasted only seconds, but understanding flooded through her like ice water. The curse wasn't about her presence in the past, it was about the growing instability between the two time periods. Her arrival had torn a hole in the fabric of reality, and that tear was widening. "Stop!" she shouted, throwing herself between the combatants, just as Magnus brought his sword down in a killing stroke meant for Bjorn. The blade stopped a hair's breadth from her throat. "You don't understand," she gasped, staring up into Magnus's cold eyes. "The curse isn't happening because I'm here. It's happening because I don't belong here. My world and yours. They're bleeding into each other." Magnus's grip on his sword remained steady, but she saw confusion flicker across his features. "Speak plainly, woman." Emma took a shaky breath. "In my time, there's an artifact, the same one that brought me here. It's breaking apart, and every crack that appears in it creates another crack between our worlds. The longer I stay, the worse it gets. Eventually—" She swallowed hard. Eventually, both timelines could collapse entirely. Bjorn lowered his weapon, his face pale. "Then the prophecy speaks not of salvation, but of ending." "Not if I can get back," Emma said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "If I return to my own time and find a way to repair the artifact, maybe I can seal the breach." Magnus finally stepped back, though his sword remained drawn. "And if you cannot?" Emma met his gaze squarely. "Then everything you've ever known will cease to exist." The morning sun cast long shadows across the village as Elena stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching Eric spar with his men. 3 days had passed since the cursed storm, and though the skies had cleared, an unnatural chill lingered in the air. The warriors moved with practiced precision, their swords singing through the morning mist, but Elena could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes kept darting to the horizon. "You're troubled," Astrid said, appearing beside her with the silent grace that seemed to run in the family. Elena didn't deny it. The visions had been getting stronger, more frequent. Last night, She'd seen glimpses of a great darkness spreading across the land, swallowing villages whole. And always, at the center of it all, was the artifact, that cursed pendant that had brought her here and seemed determined to destroy everything she was beginning to care about. "The curse is spreading," Elena said quietly. "I can feel it." Astrid nodded grimly. "The elders speak of signs, livestock born dead, wells running dry, children speaking in tongues they've never learned. The gods are angry." A sharp clang of steel drew their attention back to the training circle. Eric had disarmed his opponent with a fluid movement that left the younger warrior sprawled in the dirt, but instead of offering his usual encouragement, Eric's expression remained dark, troubled. "He blames himself," Astrid observed. "For what?" "For bringing you here, for the curse awakening." Astrid's blue eyes, so like her brother's, studied Elena carefully. "Do you blame him?" Elena watched as Eric helped his sparring partner to his feet, saw the way he carried himself, like a man bearing the weight of his people's fate. The truth was complicated. Part of her did resent being torn from her world, from everything familiar, but another part, a part that grew stronger each day, understood that this wasn't Eric's fault any more than it was hers. "No," she said finally, "we're both caught in something bigger than ourselves." The sound of galloping hooves interrupted their conversation. A rider approached at full speed, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Eric strode forward to meet him, and Elena found herself moving closer to hear the news. "Jarl Eric," the messenger gasped, sliding from his mount. "The village of Thornwick, it's gone." A cold silence fell over the training ground. Elena felt her blood turn to ice. "Gone?" Eric's voice was deadly quiet. "Swallowed by shadow, my lord. The survivors speak of a darkness that came in the night, consuming everything in its path. The very ground is blackened, as if burned by cursed fire." Elena's knees nearly gave out. Thornwick was only 2 days' ride from here. The curse was spreading faster than she'd feared, and it was heading straight for them. Eric's gaze found hers across the circle, and in his eyes she saw the same terrible understanding. This was her fault, not because she'd chosen to come here, but because her very presence was feeding the curse, making it stronger. "How many survivors?" Eric asked, though his eyes never left Elena's face. "Perhaps 24, scattered to the winds. They speak of—" The messenger hesitated, glancing nervously at Elena. "They speak of the foreign woman in their visions. Say she holds the key to either salvation or doom." The assembled warriors turned to stare at Elena, and she felt the weight of their fear, their desperate hope. Some made signs against evil. Others looked at her with something approaching reverence. Both reactions made her stomach churn. Eric dismissed the messenger and strode toward her, his expression unreadable. The crowd parted before him like water. "We need to talk," he said simply. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked in silence toward the great hall, Astrid trailing behind at a respectful distance. Inside, the warmth of the central fire did nothing to chase away the chill in Elena's bones. "Tell me about the visions," Eric said once they were alone. "Everything you've seen." Elena closed her eyes, forcing herself to relive the nightmarish images. The spreading darkness, the screaming villagers, the way the curse seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life, and always, threading through it all, the conviction that she was the catalyst, the key that had unlocked something ancient and terrible. "It's feeding on me somehow," she whispered. "My presence here, it's making the curse stronger." Eric was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Then we find a way to break it. The prophecy spoke of you as our salvation, not our destruction. What if the prophecy was wrong?" He stepped closer, his hands framing her face with surprising gentleness. "Then we make our own fate." The ancient runestone pulsed with an otherworldly light as Maya pressed her palm against its weathered surface. The moment her skin made contact, visions crashed through her mind like ocean waves against jagged cliffs. She saw herself standing in flowing white robes, speaking words in a language she didn't recognize yet somehow understood. Around her, warriors knelt in reverence, while dark shadows crept at the edges of the scene. "What did you see?" Eric's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he stood directly beside her. Maya stumbled backward, her hands still tingling with residual energy. "I saw myself, but different, speaking some kind of incantation." She looked up at him, fear evident in her eyes. "Eric, I think I'm supposed to perform some kind of ritual, but I don't know what it is or how to do it." The old seer, Astrid, hobbled forward from the shadows of the sacred grove. Her clouded eyes seemed to see more than they should. The visions come because the curse grows stronger. Each day that passes without the ritual, the barriers between worlds weaken further. As if summoned by her words, the air around them began to shimmer. Through the translucent distortion, Maya caught glimpses of her own world, the museum, car exhaust, the glow of electric lights. But the images were wrong somehow, tainted with the same creeping darkness she'd seen in her vision. "It's bleeding through," she whispered, watching a shadow creature from this realm slip through one of the shimmering gaps. The beast dissolved into smoke before it could fully materialize, but the implications were terrifying. Eric drew his sword instinctively, though the blade would be useless against such supernatural threats. "Tell us what must be done, old woman. My people grow restless, and Maya's safety—" "Your concern for her safety is admirable but misguided," Astrid interrupted. "She is the key to salvation, but only if she embraces her true nature. The woman you knew in your dreams, the one prophesied to be your bride. She was not meant to remain unchanged by this world." "The ritual," she said slowly, pieces falling into place. "It requires a willing sacrifice. Not death, but transformation. Whoever performs it becomes a guardian between worlds. They can never fully belong to either." Eric's face went pale. No, there must be another way. Before Maya could respond, a bone-chilling howl echoed across the village. Through the trees they could see smoke rising and hear the clash of weapons, but this was no ordinary raid. The attackers moved with unnatural speed, and their eyes glowed with malevolent fire. "The curse touched," Astrid breathed. "Those who have been claimed by the darkness between worlds, they seek to prevent the ritual." Eric was already running toward the battle, his warrior instincts overriding everything else. Maya started after him, but Astrid's gnarled hand caught her wrist with surprising strength. "If you go to him now, you'll doom everyone you care about," the seer said urgently. "The ritual must be performed at the moment of greatest peril, when the barriers are thinnest. That moment is now." Maya's heart tore in two as she watched Eric disappear into the melee. She could hear his battle cry rising above the chaos, could see the supernatural creatures converging on the village center where he fought. Every instinct screamed at her to run to his side, to face whatever came together. But the rune stone pulsed again, and with it came another vision, one of Eric falling beneath the claws of shadow beasts, of her own world consumed by creeping darkness, of everyone she'd ever loved in either realm paying the price for her hesitation. "What exactly happens to me?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the distant sounds of battle. "You become something between mortal and divine," Astrid replied. "A guardian who can walk between worlds but belongs fully to neither. You'll have great power, but also great loneliness. The bonds that tie you to any one place or person will be different." Maya closed her eyes, thinking of her life in the museum, her small apartment, her predictable routine. Then she thought of Eric, of his fierce protection and surprising gentleness, of a love that had somehow bloomed in impossible circumstances. Finally, she thought of all the innocent people, in this world and her own, who would suffer if she chose her own happiness over their survival. When she opened her eyes, they held a resolve that seemed to age her beyond her years. "Tell me what I need to do." The ancient words came to her lips as naturally as breathing, and the runestone's light began to spread, racing along carved channels in the earth that she hadn't noticed before. The real ritual was beginning, and there would be no turning back. The morning mist clung to the fjord like ghostly fingers as Emma stood at the water's edge, watching the funeral pyre burn in the distance. 3 more warriors had fallen during the night, their bodies consumed by the same unnatural blight that had been spreading through Bjorn's village since her arrival. The acrid smoke mixed with the salt air made her stomach churn, or perhaps it was the crushing weight of guilt that threatened to buckle her knees. "You blame yourself." Bjorn's voice carried across the rocky shore as his boots crunched against the pebbles behind her. "Shouldn't I?" Emma didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to see the pain in his ice-blue eyes again, the way his jaw tightened whenever another of his people succumbed to the curse she'd inadvertently unleashed. "Your seer was right. Death follows me like a shadow." Strong hands settled on her shoulders, and despite everything, she found herself leaning back into his warmth. 3 weeks in this harsh, beautiful world had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The soft museum curator who'd once jumped at her own shadow had learned to wield a sword, to tend battle wounds, and to face each dawn knowing it might bring fresh horror. "Astrid speaks from grief," Bjorn murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "She lost her son to the darkness 2 nights past. But you forget, you also brought us hope." Emma's fingers found the leather cord around her neck, touching the small rune stone that hung there. The ancient symbol seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, warm against her skin. According to the village's remaining elders, it was the key to everything, both their salvation and their potential doom. "Hope that might destroy everything," she whispered. "What if we're wrong, Bjorn? What if activating the ritual doesn't stop the curse but makes it worse?" His arms encircled her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Over the past weeks, these moments of quiet intimacy had become her anchor in the storm of chaos surrounding them. Despite the impossible circumstances of their meeting, despite the prophecy that claimed she was his destined bride, what had grown between them felt terrifyingly real. "Then we face that darkness together," he said simply, "as we have faced everything else." A commotion from the village made them both turn. Runners were approaching, their faces grim with news that couldn't wait. Emma's heart sank as she recognized the expression. She'd seen it too many times in recent days. "My lord," the lead messenger gasped, dropping to one knee. "Word from the eastern settlements. The blight spreads faster now. 3 villages have been consumed." "Consumed!" Emma stepped forward, dread pooling in her stomach. "Nothing remains but empty husks, my lady. The very ground is poisoned, the trees blackened as if by fire, but no flames touched them. And the people—" He shuddered, gone without a trace. Bjorn's hand found his sword hilt instinctively. "How long ago?" 2 days, perhaps 3. "At this rate—" The messenger swallowed hard. "At this rate, it will reach our shores within the week." Emma closed her eyes, seeing again the moment in the museum when her fingers had first touched the ancient artifact. She'd been so innocent then, fascinated by Viking history, drawn to the intricate carvings on what the placard had called a ritual binding stone. The electric shock that had transported her through time had seemed like magic. Now she understood it was something far more dangerous. "We cannot wait any longer," she said, opening her eyes to meet Bjorn's gaze. "The ritual must happen tonight. Emma, we've discussed this. The moon won't be full for another 3 days, and without—" "There won't be 3 days," her voice cracked with desperation. "Don't you understand? Every hour we wait, more people die. The curse isn't just some abstract threat anymore. It's devouring everything in its path, and it's my fault." Bjorn cupped her face in his calloused hands, forcing her to look at him. "Your arrival may have triggered this, but you did not create it. The curse was already here, sleeping in the spaces between worlds. Someone would have awakened it eventually. But it was me. Tears she'd been holding back for days finally spilled over. It was me, and now I have to fix it. Even if what?" She couldn't say the words aloud. That according to the ancient texts they'd deciphered, the ritual required a sacrifice. That the bride from another time would have to choose between saving this world and returning to her own. That love, real as it had become, might not be enough to overcome the cosmic forces they were tampering with. Instead, she stood on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her unspoken fears and desperate hope into the connection between them. When they broke apart, his eyes held an understanding that made her heart ache. "Tonight, then," he whispered. "We end this tonight." The ancient runestones stood in a perfect circle, their weathered surfaces covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering torchlight. Astrid pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the chamber, watching as Bjorn traced the carved marks with reverent fingers. "These are old," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of thunder. "Older than my grandfather's grandfather." She wanted to tell him they were likely from the Bronze Age, wanted to share everything she knew about early Scandinavian runic traditions, but the words died in her throat as one of the symbols began to glow with an eerie blue light. "Bjorn." Her voice cracked with fear. He spun toward her, hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. The glow spread from stone to stone like wildfire, each rune igniting until the entire chamber pulsed with otherworldly light. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that made Astrid's skin crawl and her hair stand on end. "The prophecy speaks of this place," Bjorn said, moving to stand between her and the nearest stone, "where the veil between worlds grows thin." A low humming filled the air, growing louder with each pulse of light. Astrid felt something tugging at her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced when touching the artifact in the museum. The pull was stronger now, more insistent, as if something was calling her home. "It's trying to take me back," she whispered, reaching for his hand. His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and solid and reassuringly real, not without breaking the curse first. His jaw set in the stubborn line she'd grown to love. "We finish this here, together." The humming reached a crescendo, and suddenly the chamber filled with ghostly figures. Warriors in ancient armor materialized between the stones, their translucent forms flickering like candle flames. At their head stood a woman whose presence commanded the very air around her, the Cedra witch Ingrid. Bjorn breathed, and Astrid felt his hand tighten around hers. The spectral woman turned toward them, her eyes boring into Astrid with an intensity that made her soul feel exposed. When she spoke, her voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. "So, the prophesied bride has come at last." Ingrid's form glided closer, and the temperature plummeted. "Do you know what you have wrought, child of the future?" "I know you cursed Bjorn's bloodline out of spite," Astrid replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "And I know that love is stronger than any magic you can conjure." Ingrid's laugh was like winter wind through bare branches. "Love?" The ghost circled them slowly, her warriors maintaining their silent vigil. "You think love will save you when the realms collapse? When your world bleeds into mine and destroys everything?" The runestones pulsed brighter, and through the spaces between them, Astrid glimpsed impossible visions, skyscrapers crumbling under the weight of longships sailing through clouds, modern cities where Vikings walked alongside people in business suits, two realities bleeding together in catastrophic fusion. "The curse was never about revenge," Ingrid continued, her form becoming more solid with each word. "It was a seal, holding the barriers between times in place. Your arrival here has weakened it beyond repair." Bjorn stepped forward, his warrior's instincts overriding his awe. "Then tell us how to fix it." "Fix it?" Ingrid's eyes blazed with cold fire. "There is no fixing this, wolf son. There is only choosing which world survives." The chamber shuddered, and cracks appeared in the ancient stones. Through the fissures, Astrid could see glimpses of the museum where this all began, the sterile white walls and glass cases seeming impossibly distant and strange. "Choose," Ingrid demanded. "Return to your time and let the barriers heal, or stay and watch both worlds burn in the merging." Astrid felt the blood drain from her face. "You're saying I can't have both? I can't stay here without destroying everything?" "The magic that brought you here demands balance," the witch replied with something that might have been pity. A life freely given can break any curse, but the cost. She gestured to the crumbling chamber around them. Time itself rebels against your presence here. Bjorn's grip on her hand became almost painful. There has to be another way. The runes speak only truth, warrior. She must choose, and quickly. The barriers fail more with each passing moment. Through the growing cracks, Astrid could hear sounds from her own time. Car horns, the hum of electricity, the distant drone of airplanes, her world calling her back. But looking at Bjorn, at the man who had become her anchor in this strange time, the choice seemed impossible. The runestones pulsed again, more urgently now, and several of the ghostly warriors began to fade. Ingrid herself flickered like a dying flame. "Decide, child of two worlds," the witch whispered as her form began to dissolve, "before the choice is made for you." The chamber filled with blinding light, and Astrid felt the inexorable pull of time itself, demanding an answer she wasn't ready to give. The ancient runes carved into the stone altar pulsed with an otherworldly light as Emma pressed her palms against the cold surface. The moment her skin made contact, visions flooded her mind, fragments of the past and glimpses of a terrifying future where both worlds lay in ruins. "I can see it," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing wind that whipped through the sacred grove. "The curse, it's not just binding our worlds together, it's feeding on the connection, growing stronger." Bjorn stood behind her, his hand resting protectively on the hilt of his sword as shadows danced between the ancient oak trees. The other warriors formed a defensive circle around them, their faces grim as unnatural sounds echoed from the darkness beyond. "What do you see, little raven?" Bjorn's voice was steady, but Emma could hear the underlying tension. They'd been fighting manifestations of the curse for days, twisted creatures that belonged to neither time nor place, growing bolder and more dangerous with each encounter. Emma's fingers traced the intricate patterns carved into the stone, following the spiraling design that seemed to shift and move beneath her touch. "The woman in my dreams, she's not just a memory. She's trapped between the worlds, and her rage is what's tearing everything apart. She was meant to be here, meant to be with someone she loved, but she was taken before the ritual could be completed." A bone-chilling howl pierced the night, closer than before. The torches flickering around the grove sputtered, as if responding to some unseen force. "The creatures are getting closer," Magnus called out, his weathered face pale in the torchlight. "Whatever you're going to do it quickly." Emma closed her eyes, letting the visions wash over her completely. She saw the ancient priestess being dragged away from this very altar, saw her lover's anguished face as he tried to fight off the raiders who had interrupted their sacred ceremony. The binding spell had been half completed when it was broken, leaving both the priestess and her intended trapped in an endless cycle of longing and rage. "She needs to be released," Emma said, opening her eyes to meet Bjorn's concerned gaze. "But to break the original binding, we need to complete what was started. The ritual requires—" Her words died as a figure materialized from the shadows between the trees. Not one of the twisted creatures they'd been fighting, but a woman in ancient Norse dress, her long dark hair whipping around her shoulders like smoke. Her eyes burned with centuries of accumulated fury and pain. The priestess had finally manifested fully in their world. The warriors raised their weapons, but Bjorn held up a hand to stop them. "She's not our enemy," he said quietly, though his muscles remained tense. "She's a victim." The ghostly woman's gaze fixed on Emma, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of ages. "You carry the blood of the Volva, the seer women of old. You can finish what was broken." Her form flickered like a candle flame in the wind. "But know this, the price for my freedom may be higher than you're willing to pay." Emma stepped closer to the altar, feeling the power thrumming through the stone grow stronger. "What price?" "One soul anchored each world to the other when the curse began. One soul must remain to maintain the balance when it ends." The priestess's form began to solidify, becoming more real and present. The ritual that brought you here created a bridge. Breaking the curse means someone must choose to guard that bridge for eternity. The implications hit Emma like a physical blow. Either she stayed in this time forever, never returning home, or Bjorn would have to somehow cross into her world, leaving everything he'd ever known behind. The curse could be broken, but not without sacrifice. Thunder rumbled overhead despite the clear sky, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The manifestation of the priestess was destabilizing everything around them. "There has to be another way," Bjorn said fiercely, moving to Emma's side. "I won't lose you to some ancient magic, and I won't ask you to give up your world for mine." Emma looked at him, seeing the determination in his storm-grey eyes, the set of his jaw that she'd come to recognize when he was preparing for battle. This proud Viking warrior would fight the gods themselves for her, but some battles couldn't be won with sword and shield. "The ritual must be completed tonight," the priestess said, her voice growing urgent. "The moon reaches its peak within the hour, and if the curse isn't broken then, it will become permanent. Both worlds will be consumed by the chaos between them." Emma placed her hand over Bjorn's, drawing strength from his touch. Around them, the warriors stood ready to defend them against whatever horrors the night might bring. But she knew that this battle would be fought with magic older than their oldest legends. The choice before them was impossible, but it was theirs to make. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally broke just as Astrid finished translating the final runes carved into the sacred stone. Lightning split the sky above the grove, illuminating the ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy beneath her fingertips. "The binding can only be severed when the bridge between worlds weakens," she read aloud, her voice barely audible over the growing tempest. "But the price demands a willing sacrifice of what is most precious." Eric stood behind her, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword as shadows began to creep between the trees like living things. The curse was growing stronger, feeding off the magical energy that had brought her here. "What does it mean, Astrid? What price?" Before she could answer, the darkness surged forward with unnatural speed. Eric drew his blade in one fluid motion, the steel singing as it cut through the air, but his sword passed harmlessly through the writhing shadows, and they coalesced around him like chains. "Eric!" Astrid lunged toward him, but invisible force threw her backward against the stone. Pain exploded through her shoulder as she hit the carved surface, and suddenly the runes blazed with blinding light. Images flooded her mind, visions of the past and future colliding in a torrent of possibility. She saw herself back in her own time, safe but alone, while this world crumbled into eternal darkness. She saw Eric falling in battle after battle, searching for a way to follow her across the void between worlds until death finally claimed him. And she saw a third path, narrow and treacherous, that required her to choose between her heart and her very existence. The visions faded, leaving her gasping on the forest floor as Eric struggled against the shadow bonds that held him. The darkness was spreading beyond the grove now, reaching toward the village like grasping fingers. "I understand now," she whispered, pulling herself upright. The ancient magic in the stone responded to her presence, recognizing something in her blood that she was only beginning to comprehend. "I'm not just here by accident. My family, we're descendants of the original curse-makers. That's why I can see the runes, why I can read them when others can't." Eric's eyes widened with understanding and terror. "Astrid, no. Whatever you're thinking." "The curse feeds on the connection between our worlds," she continued, moving closer to the stone despite the energy that crackled around it like lightning. "It grows stronger every moment I stay here. But if I can channel that connection, redirect it." The shadows sensed her intent and abandoned Eric, rushing toward her with desperate fury. But she was ready for them now. Drawing on knowledge that felt both foreign and familiar, she pressed both palms against the carved stone and spoke words in a language she'd never learned but somehow knew. The grove exploded with light. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as they dissolved, but Astrid could feel the curse fighting back. It had grown too strong over the centuries, too deeply rooted in both worlds to be easily banished. The stone grew burning hot beneath her hands, but she held on, pouring her own life force into the ancient binding. "There has to be another way," Eric shouted over the magical storm, reaching for her even as energy arced between them. "I won't lose you, not when I've just found you." She turned to look at him, memorizing every detail of his face as power coursed through her veins like molten fire. "Some things are worth more than our own happiness, Eric. Your world, your people, they deserve to survive." But even as she spoke the words, she felt the curse adapting, learning from her attempt to control it. The magic was slipping from her grasp, and she realized with growing horror that her sacrifice might not be enough. The connection between the worlds was too complex, too deeply woven into the fabric of reality itself. Then Eric was beside her, his hands covering hers on the burning stone. "Together," he said simply, "if this is our fate, we face it together." The moment their joined hands touched the runes, everything changed. The wild magic steadied, responding to their combined will in ways that neither could achieve alone. But Astrid could feel the terrible choice still looming before them: save both worlds at the cost of their connection to each other, or preserve their love and watch everything else burn. Thunder crashed overhead as if the very gods were watching, waiting for their decision. In the distance she could hear the sounds of the village stirring, voices calling out in fear as the unnatural darkness crept closer to their homes. The stone pulsed beneath their joined hands, offering its ancient power but demanding its price. And somewhere in the space between heartbeats, between one world and another, Astrid made her choice. The ancient runes carved into the stone circle pulsed with an eerie blue light as Astrid placed her hands against the cold surface. The wind had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness that made every whisper of movement seem amplified. Behind her she could hear Bjorn's labored breathing as he struggled against the curse that was slowly consuming him. "The prophecy speaks of sacrifice," she murmured, tracing the symbols with trembling fingers, "but it doesn't specify what kind." The museum artifact, her pendant, grew warm against her chest, responding to the proximity of its ancient counterparts embedded in the stone. Through their mystical connection, she could feel the barrier between worlds growing thinner with each passing moment. The curse was accelerating, feeding on the temporal disruption her arrival had caused. "Astrid!" Bjorn's voice was strained, barely recognizable. Dark veins had spread up his arms like poisonous vines, and his eyes flickered between their natural blue and an unsettling silver. "You must go. Use the circle while you still can." She turned to face him, her heart breaking at the sight of the proud warrior reduced to this tortured shell. "I won't leave you like this. The curse will consume everything if it reaches the heart of our realm," he said, falling to one knee as another wave of pain coursed through him. "Your world, mine, all of it will be lost." The pendant grew hotter against her skin, and suddenly she understood. The artifact wasn't just a key between worlds, it was a conduit designed to channel the life force of its bearer. The ancient Volva who had created the prophecy had known exactly what would be required. "There is another way," she whispered, pulling the pendant over her head. Its surface gleamed with otherworldly energy, casting dancing shadows across the stone circle. As her fingers closed around the artifact, visions flooded her mind. She saw the original curse being cast by a desperate sorceress whose village had been destroyed by raiders. She witnessed the creation of the pendant by wise women who sought to balance the scales of fate. And she understood the true nature of the sacrifice required. "No." Bjorn struggled to his feet, reading her intentions in her expression. "I will not allow you to—" "It's not your choice," she said firmly, stepping toward the center of the circle where the runic patterns converged. "This curse exists because of the hatred between our peoples, the endless cycle of violence and revenge. It can only be broken by someone who belongs to both worlds." The pendant's light intensified, and she could feel its power calling to her, but this wasn't the wild, uncontrolled energy she had experienced during her initial transport. This was purposeful, directed, a tool waiting to be wielded by someone who truly understood its purpose. "The prophecy doesn't demand death," she continued, her voice growing stronger as clarity filled her mind. It demands transformation. She pressed the pendant against the central runestone, and the entire circle erupted in brilliant light. The curse that had been spreading through Bjorn suddenly reversed course, flowing toward the artifact like water being drawn down a drain. But instead of simply disappearing, the dark energy began to transform, its malevolent nature slowly shifting into something else entirely. Astrid gasped as she felt the change begin within herself. The pendant was rewriting the very fabric of her existence, binding her permanently to this time while simultaneously anchoring a piece of it to her own era. She was becoming a living bridge between worlds, a guardian of the temporal boundaries that kept both realms safe. The pain was excruciating, like being torn apart and rebuilt at the molecular level, but through it all, she held onto the image of Bjorn's face, using their connection as an anchor to keep herself grounded in this reality. When the light finally faded, she found herself still standing in the circle, but everything had changed. She could feel both worlds existing within her consciousness, the weight of centuries pressing against her awareness while the familiar hum of modern technology whispered at the edges of her perception. Bjorn rushed to her side, the dark veins completely gone from his skin. "Astrid, what have you done?" "What needed to be done?" she replied, though her voice sounded different somehow, older, carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from distant places and times. "The curse is broken, but the balance must be maintained." She looked down at the pendant, which had fused seamlessly with her palm, its surface now showing an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and change as she watched. Through it, she could sense the delicate equilibrium between past and future, could feel the exact moment when that balance might be threatened. "I can never return to my own time," she said, the full weight of her choice settling over her like a heavy cloak. "But I can ensure that the pathways between our worlds remain sealed, that this kind of catastrophe never happens again." Bjorn took her transformed hand in his calloused fingers gentle against her altered skin. "Then we face this new existence together." The ancient runes carved into the stone circle pulsed with an otherworldly light as Emma pressed her palms against the cold granite. The curse's energy writhed beneath her fingertips like a living thing, desperate to break free from the bonds that had held it for centuries. Around her, the very air crackled with malevolent power, and she could feel it testing her resolve, probing for weakness. "I can feel it fighting me," she gasped, her voice strained with effort. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the frigid wind that whipped across the clifftop sanctuary. "It's so much stronger than I expected." Bjorn stood behind her, his massive frame tense with barely controlled energy. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, though he knew no blade could cut through the supernatural forces at work here. "You are stronger," he said firmly. "The prophecy chose you for a reason." The old seeress, Astrid, hobbled closer on her gnarled walking stick, her milky eyes fixed on something beyond the physical realm. "The curse feeds on doubt and fear," she warned. "It will show you visions. Try to break your concentration. Do not let it." As if summoned by her words, the world around Emma began to shift and blur. The stone circle faded, replaced by flashes of her old life, her cramped apartment in Chicago, a demanding job at the marketing firm, the endless cycle of loneliness that had defined her existence before the artifact changed everything. She saw herself growing old and alone, never having found love, never having discovered her true purpose. "It's not real," she whispered to herself, but the visions felt achingly authentic. She could smell her favorite coffee shop, hear the rumble of traffic outside her window, feel the familiar weight of unfulfilled dreams pressing down on her chest. The curse struck again, this time showing her Bjorn falling in battle, his blue eyes vacant and staring. She saw the village burning, children screaming as darkness consumed everything she had come to love. The images were so vivid, so terrifying that her concentration wavered for a moment. Immediately, the stone circle shuddered, and cracks began to spider across its surface. The runes flared brighter, their light turning from blue to an ominous red. "Emma!" Bjorn's voice cut through the illusion like a blade. Stay with me. Stay here in this moment." She forced herself to focus on his voice, using it as an anchor in the storm of false visions. Gradually, the images of her old life and the nightmare futures began to fade. The stone grew warm beneath her hands, and she felt the curse's energy beginning to respond to her will. But the ancient magic had one more weapon in its arsenal. Instead of showing her fears, it began to whisper promises. She could return to her own time with Bjorn at her side. They could live as gods among mortals, wielding the curse's power to reshape the world according to their desires. No one would ever hurt them again. No one could ever take away their happiness. For a heartbeat, the offer was almost irresistible. The power flowing through her was intoxicating, making her feel invincible. She could sense the vast potential contained within the curse, the ability to bend reality itself to her will. "The power is yours by right," the curse whispered in a voice like honey and poison. "You are the bridge between worlds. Why destroy what could serve you?" Emma's grip on the stones tightened. She thought of the warrior who had claimed her heart, of the village that had become her home, of all the innocent lives that hung in the balance. The curse wasn't offering her power, it was offering her corruption, the chance to become the very evil she had come here to destroy. "Because love isn't about power," she said aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's about sacrifice. It's about choosing something greater than yourself." The curse shrieked in fury, its whispers becoming a roar of rage. The stone circle blazed with light so intense that Bjorn had to shield his eyes. Emma felt the malevolent energy fighting her with everything it had, trying to tear itself free from her grasp and spread its poison across both worlds. But she held fast, pouring every ounce of her will into containing the ancient evil. She thought of her love for Bjorn, her friendship with the villagers, her desire to protect the innocent. Each emotion became a weapon against the darkness, each memory a chain to bind the curse. Slowly, inexorably, she began to force the chaotic energy back into the space between worlds where it belonged. The curse fought her every step of the way, but its struggles grew weaker as she compressed it further and further. Almost there, Astrid breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "The child is actually doing it." Emma's entire body trembled with exhaustion, but she could feel victory within her grasp. Just a little more, and the curse would be contained forever. The fate of two worlds balanced on her fingertips, and she refused to let either one fall. The ancient runes carved into the stone circle pulsed with an otherworldly light as Elena pressed her palms against the cold surface. The artifact's power coursed through her veins like liquid fire, and she could feel the barrier between worlds growing thinner with each passing moment. Behind her, the sound of clashing steel echoed across the blood-soaked battlefield where Bjorn fought desperately to hold back the shadow creatures that poured from the widening rifts. "The curse seeks to merge our worlds completely," Astrid shouted over the howling wind that had begun to tear at their clothes and hair. The old seeress's eyes were wide with terror as she watched reality itself begin to fracture. If it succeeds, both timelines will collapse into chaos. Elena gritted her teeth, feeling the weight of two worlds pressing down on her shoulders. Through her connection to the artifact, she could sense the museum in her own time, panicked voices, alarms blaring, and the same strange energy readings that had first drawn her to touch the cursed object. The worlds were bleeding into each other, and she was the conduit through which destruction flowed. A roar of pain cut through the air, and Elena's heart lurched as she saw Bjorn stumble backward, dark blood streaming from a gash across his chest. 3 shadow creatures circled him like wolves, their forms shifting and writhing as they prepared for another attack. His warriors had fallen back, forming a desperate line of defense, but Elena could see they wouldn't last much longer. "There has to be another way," she gasped, her connection to the stone circle sending waves of ancient knowledge flooding through her mind. Images flashed before her eyes, other wielders of the artifact's power, other times when the curse had threatened to break free. But in every vision, the ending was the same: sacrifice. The prophecy speaks of balance. Astrid said, her voice barely audible above the chaos. Two hearts joined across time, but only one can anchor both worlds. The other must... No. Elena's voice was fierce with determination. I won't accept that. There's always another choice. She closed her eyes and dove deeper into the artifact's consciousness, searching through layers of accumulated magic and memory. The curse was old, older than Bjorn's people, older than the Vikings themselves. It had been created by a civilization lost to history, their desperate attempt to preserve their dying world by claiming another. But curses, like all magic, had rules, and rules could be broken. The sound of Bjorn's war cry snapped her attention back to the present. He had rallied his men for what looked like a final charge, his sword blazing with the same ethereal light that surrounded the stone circle. But even his legendary skill couldn't match the endless tide of shadow creatures that kept pouring through the rifts. I need more time, Elena called out to him, her voice somehow carrying clearly across the battlefield. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw understanding pass between them. Whatever the cost, he would give her the time she needed. Bjorn raised his sword high and let out a battle cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. His remaining warriors answered with their own fierce shouts, and together they threw themselves at the shadow army with the desperate courage of men who knew they faced their final battle. Elena turned back to the stone circle, her hands moving in patterns that felt both foreign and familiar. The artifact's power responded to her touch, and she began to unweave the curse's binding threads one by one. But for every connection she severed, two more seemed to take its place, and she could feel her strength beginning to fade. Then she felt warm hands cover hers, and Bjorn's presence filled the space behind her. Somehow he had fought his way through the chaos to reach her side, his armor battered and his face streaked with blood, but his blue eyes still burning with unwavering determination. Together, he said simply, and Elena felt his strength flow into her through their joined hands. The curse fought against them with renewed fury, sending bolts of dark energy crackling through the air. But Elena and Bjorn held fast, their combined will forcing the ancient magic to bend to their purpose. The stone circle began to resonate with a different frequency, one that spoke of healing rather than destruction. It's working, Astrid breathed, her voice filled with wonder. The shadow creatures had begun to waver and fade, drawn back toward the closing rifts between worlds. But even as victory seemed within reach, Elena felt the artifact demanding its price. The magic was too powerful, too volatile to simply dismiss. It needed an anchor, a focal point to contain its energy, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her blood, that one of them would have to pay that price. The choice was hers to make, and time was running out. The ancient runes carved into the mountain face blazed with otherworldly fire as Emma pressed her palms against the cold stone. The curse fought against her touch, sending waves of searing pain through her arms, but she held firm. Behind her she could hear Eric's battle cry echoing across the valley as he and his warriors fought desperately against the shadow creatures that poured endlessly from the growing rifts between worlds. "I need more time," she gasped, her modern knowledge of electromagnetic fields and quantum physics warring with the mystical forces that coursed through the Viking artifact still fused to her wrist. The golden armband pulsed with heat, its intricate knotwork patterns shifting and changing as it tried to channel her will into something the ancient magic could understand. A shadow beast's screech pierced the air, closer now. Too close. Emma could feel its malevolent presence approaching, drawn by the power she was unleashing. The creature's claws scraped against stone as it began climbing toward her position on the mountainside. "Emma!" Eric's voice was strained with exhaustion and fear. She risked a glance over her shoulder to see him breaking away from the main battle, his sword dripping with the dark ichor that passed for blood in these nightmare creatures. His shield bore deep gouges, and blood seeped from a wound on his shoulder, but his eyes burned with unwavering determination. The shadow beast lunged at her just as Eric reached the ledge. His blade sang through the air, dispersing the creature in a shower of darkness, but 3 more were already scaling the cliff face behind it. They were running out of time. The rifts were widening, and through them Emma could see glimpses of her own world. The museum where this all began, its sterile fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the supernatural chaos consuming the Viking realm. The prophecy spoke of sacrifice, Eric said, positioning himself between her and the approaching shadows. But it didn't specify whose. Emma's heart clenched as she understood his meaning. No, Eric. There has to be another way. The artifact chose me for a reason. I can feel it. I just need to understand how to redirect the curse's energy instead of simply trying to contain it. Her fingers traced the glowing runes, and suddenly the patterns made sense. It wasn't about stopping the curse. It was about completing the circuit it was trying to create. The ancient magic had been designed to bridge worlds, not destroy them. But something had corrupted its purpose long ago, turning what should have been a gateway into a weapon. The curse isn't the real enemy, she breathed, the revelation hitting her like lightning. Someone or something perverted the original magic. That's why the prophecy mentioned a bride. It wasn't about a destined love story. It was about finding someone who could see the truth because they came from the other side. Eric's sword flashed again, cutting down 2 more shadow beasts, but his breathing was labored. Below them, his warriors were being slowly overwhelmed, despite their fierce courage. Olaf's horn sounded 3 sharp blasts, the signal for retreat, though Emma knew there was nowhere left to run. "Then do what you must," Eric said, his voice carrying all the love and trust that had grown between them over these impossible weeks. "I believe in you." Emma closed her eyes and let her consciousness sink deep into the artifact's core. Instead of fighting the curse, she embraced it, following its twisted pathways back to their source. Through layers of corruption and malevolent influence, she found the original spell, beautiful and pure, designed by ancient seers who had dreamed of connection between worlds, not conquest. The shadow that had corrupted it was old and hungry, feeding on the chaos it created. It writhed in fury as Emma's touch began unraveling centuries of carefully constructed perversion. But it didn't go quietly. The creature, for it was indeed a creature, something that existed in the spaces between worlds, lashed out with all its accumulated power. Emma screamed as alien hatred flooded through her mind, trying to break her will and reclaim its hold on the ancient magic. The golden armband grew white-hot against her skin, and she felt something fundamental shifting in the fabric of reality itself. But Eric was there, his hand covering hers on the stone, his warrior's strength anchoring her to the physical world even as her consciousness battled in realms beyond mortal understanding. Their connection, forged through danger, tempered by trust and strengthened by love, became a lifeline that the corrupting shadow couldn't sever. With a sound like breaking crystal, the curse finally shattered. The shadow creature's death shriek echoed across dimensions before fading to blessed silence. The rifts between worlds began to close, but slowly, gently, as the restored magic sought its true purpose. Emma collapsed against Eric's chest, drained but triumphant. The shadow beasts were dissolving like morning mist, and golden light was beginning to spread across the battlefield. But her relief was tempered by a terrible realization. The closing rifts would soon cut off any path back to her own time. The ancient runestone pulsed with otherworldly light as Elena pressed her palms against its carved surface, feeling the curse's malevolent energy coursing through the stone like poison through veins. Around them, reality continued to fracture, the museum's sterile walls bleeding through the Viking settlement's wooden structures, creating a nightmarish amalgamation of 2 worlds that should never have touched. "The binding must be willing," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the howling winds that had begun to tear at the fabric of time itself. Both worlds, both times, they have to choose to separate. Bjorn stood behind her, his massive frame a shield against the chaos erupting around them. Warriors from his clan fought desperately against the shadow creatures that poured from the temporal rifts, their steel weapons proving futile against beings born from cursed magic. In the distance, She could hear the screams of museum visitors trapped in this impossible nightmare, their modern world invaded by ancient terrors. "Tell me what you need," Bjorn commanded, his voice steady despite the apocalypse unfolding around them. Elena closed her eyes, reaching deep into the connection she'd forged with the artifact that had brought her here. The curse fought back, sending waves of agony through her body, trying to convince her that she belonged to neither world, that she was an aberration that would destroy everything she touched. She pushed deeper, past the curse's lies, until she found the truth buried in the runestone's heart. The prophecy hadn't been about a bride at all. It had been a warning, mistranslated across centuries. She wasn't meant to stay in Bjorn's world. She was meant to heal the wound her arrival had torn between the timelines. "The curse feeds on displacement," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "When I came here, I created a paradox, but if I can accept that I belong in my time, and you can let me go, truly let me go, the worlds will snap back into alignment." Bjorn's hand found her shoulder, his touch grounding her, even as the runestone's power threatened to tear her apart. "And if I cannot? If my heart refuses to release you?" The question hung between them like a blade. Elena felt the curse's hungry anticipation, waiting for their love to damn both worlds. Around them, another building materialized, her apartment complex translucent and wrong, overlapping with the Viking longhouse where Bjorn's people had taken shelter. "Then, everyone dies," she said simply. "Your people, mine, everyone." A shadow creature lunged at them, its claws extended, but Bjorn's sword sang through the air, dispersing it into mist. More kept coming, drawn by the temporal instability, feeding on the chaos. "There has to be another way," Bjorn growled, but Elena could hear the defeat creeping into his voice. He knew, as she did, that some prices were too high to pay. Elena turned in his arms, memorizing his face, the scar across his jaw from their first battle together, the fierce blue eyes that had seen her not as a strange outlander, but as something precious worth protecting. In the few weeks she'd lived in his world, he had become more real to her than anything in her previous life. "I love you," she said, and felt the curse recoil at the honesty in her words. "In every timeline, in every possibility, I love you. But loving you means saving your world." Bjorn's jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he would refuse, would choose their love over everything else. Then his warrior's honor, the same integrity that had made her fall for him, won out. "And I love you enough to let you go," he said, his voice breaking on the words. Elena pressed her forehead against his, sharing one last moment of perfect connection before turning back to the runestone. The curse sensed what was coming and fought viciously, sending tendrils of dark magic to tear at her mind, showing her visions of the life she could have with Bjorn if she just let the worlds burn. But she had found her strength in his world, not just the power to fight, but the courage to sacrifice for something greater than herself. "I, Elena Morrison, willingly return to my time," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "I release my claim on this world and accept my place in the one where I belong. And I, Bjorn Ironson, release her from all bonds that tie her to this time," Bjorn added, his voice steady despite the tears tracking down his cheeks. "Let the worlds be whole." The runestone erupted in blinding light. Elena felt herself being torn away from everything she had come to love, the curse finally shattering as the paradox of her presence resolved itself. The last thing she saw was Bjorn's face, proud and heartbroken, as the timeline snapped apart with the force of breaking chains. Then darkness claimed her, and she fell through the centuries toward home,